Friends, our reading this morning is a poem called Poem by Muriel Rukeyser. Poem. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted only by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. But slowly I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day, I would be reminded of these men and women brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a new, nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. We would try to imagine them. We would try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, to reconcile ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limits of ourselves, to reach out beyond ourselves, to let go of the means of war, and to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars. This past summer, August 6th, marked the 80th anniversary of the United States dropping an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. A bomb that, in a flash, killed nearly 150,000 people. On several occasions, I've been privileged to commemorate this solemn anniversary in Hiroshima as the guest of a community of bomb survivors with whom my former church has a long relationship. But this year, I spent the anniversary alone, quietly reflecting on these earlier visits, the people I'd met, the stories I heard. I looked back at the horrific images of the bombing and read again the testimony of survivors. And this year, I was chilled to discover how contemporary it all felt. Friends, photos of Hiroshima after the bomb are nearly indistinguishable from images of Gaza today. They are. The internment camps where the United States detained Japanese Americans during the war resemble nothing so much as today's ICE detention centers. It seems to me that again and again, we find ourselves living in the midst of, or in the wake of, injustices and devastations wrought by forces much larger than us, by rulers and armies, devastations that we often did not ask for or participate in, but that nonetheless were committed in our name and on our watch. And time and again, when it's all over, when the powerful are done wreaking their havoc, we're the ones left holding the bag, right? It falls to us, regular folks, civilians, communities like ours, people on all sides of the conflict. It's left to us to try to repair what's been broken. to make apologies and amends, to seek reconciliation and reparation and try to find a way forward again, because the generals and the rulers, they're not going to do that for us. But how do we do that? Because the nations and their armies have so many resources, so much force at their disposal. But what do we have? But ourselves and one another and our fervent desire to live in peace, to flourish. I'm reminded of a line from the poet Adrian Rich, who writes, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I must cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely and with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." That's us. And this morning I want to share a story with you. It's a humble story, it's just one, of how two communities, a Unitarian church in Washington and a group of atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima, communities who possessed no extraordinary power, but who nonetheless tried to reconstitute the world, or at least their little corner of it, to heal what was broken. And along the way, I hope I might point out some lessons from that experience that might offer us a path forward for how we might repair what's been broken in our time and in our name. I'm always curious how these stories of reconciliation begin. This one starts with a photo that ran in the Washington Post on November 8th, 1946. Picture it if you can. It pictures top military brass at a gala event in D.C. The men are dressed in their military formal wear, women in beautiful floor-length gowns, and at the center of the photo are several people with big smiles on their face and a knife in their hands, ready to cut a cake. They look like they're at a wedding. But this was no wedding. The cake was made in the shape of a mushroom cloud. And the gala was to celebrate the successful dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. The following Sunday, the minister of All Souls in Washington, D.C., A. Powell Davies, stepped into the pulpit and he was brandishing the newspaper in his hand, asking, in what universe is the immediate death of 150,000 people cause for celebration? Right? How, he asked, could such deadly force be memorialized with buttercream frosting? To delight in the suffering of another, the moral callousness outraged Davies, and he gave voice to his outrage. His sermon made headlines, and the outrage spread. And so right away, my first question that comes to mind for us is, how have we allowed our moral sense, our conscience, to be dulled or co-opted or silenced by the prevailing apathy and cruelty? When have we failed to speak of our outrage? But outrage isn't enough. We must find work that we can do to repair what's been damaged. At the same time that photo appeared in the Post, a member of All Souls who was doing relief work in Hiroshima, told the church of an elementary school there where children were learning in a bombed-out building with no school supplies. This time it was the children in the Sunday school who responded by taking up a collection of art supplies to send to the kids in Hiroshima. Word spread and others in D.C. pitched in. Pretty soon the Children of All Souls sent over a ton of art supplies to Japan. Several months later, a package arrived back at church addressed to the children. When they opened the package on Sunday morning, they were just surprised to see crayon and pastel drawings, works of art made by the elementary school kids with the supplies they'd received from the church. A thank you. More exchanges ensued. Now, these pictures are rare among survivor art, for they depict not the devastations of war, but images of flourishing life in Japan. Children playing baseball and cherry trees in blossom, a boy's shiny toy racing car. Each image bore the name of the young person who made it. The drawings made news back in Washington, so much so, this being Washington, that the State Department got wind of it and sent the pictures on tour across the United States, touting the renewed bonds of peace between Japan and the United States. What began as a Sunday school art supply drive suddenly became something larger, right? But here's the thing. After that initial burst of energy, the relationship between the church and the school went dormant. For many decades, the drawings were largely forgotten. We had tucked them away in the basement of our church. Until one day, early in my ministry at All Souls, a bus full of Japanese tourists pulled up outside the church and asked, "Is this the church with the Hiroshima children's drawings?" We might have forgotten the drawings, but the Japanese hadn't. We led them down to the basement, and for the first time in years brought the drawings out. The Japanese marveled at them, treated them as if they were the sacred relics of an ancestor. One visitor was so moved, she returned to Japan and began looking for the children who'd made the drawings, who were now in their 70s. She met quite a few and discovered that most of them remembered the gift of art supplies and the drawing that they'd made. That's when the church decided to have the drawings restored and framed, and we brought them to Japan one year on the anniversary of the bombing so that the artists could be reunited with their creation. Through this and other visits, the relationship between the church and the bomb survivors strengthened and grew to include a local Buddhist congregation. We hosted exchanges and homestays. We worshiped together in Washington and Japan. We formed intimate circles of reconciliation where we discussed the legacies of war and violence. We lobbied for peace together. Meanwhile, a filmmaker learned of the story and came along to document the unfolding of this relationship, eventually producing a film called Pictures from a Hiroshima Schoolyard. You can stream it on Roku. What I learned is that relationships are, of course, essential to reconciliation. Maintaining relationship is difficult over time. When we fail, we try again with humility. Are there relationships in your own life that must be tended to in order for healing to occur? Are you ready to try again? There have been many surprises over the course of this relationship. One of them happened the first time we traveled to Japan and to listen to the testimony of bombing survivors. A small elderly woman stood up in the pulpit to address us, to tell her story of the war. And the first words out of her mouth were incredibly, "I'm sorry." Before she told us how she'd been evacuated from Hiroshima along with other children the day before the bomb. Before she described witnessing the mushroom cloud grow over her hometown. Before she detailed her eventual return to the city and her futile search for her dead parents. Before she spoke of the lasting effects of radiation sickness and survivor's guilt, before any of that, she said, "I'm sorry." And we said, "For what?" And she said, "I'm sorry for my nation's military aggression against yours." We'd come believing we were the ones to apologize, right? And we were, and we did. But she did first. And in doing so, she taught me how much strength and courage it takes to say, "I'm sorry." And how those two words are the foundation of any reconciliation. I'm sorry. To whom do you need to say those words? To whom do we need to say those words? The other misconception going into the relationship was believing that we were going to Hiroshima to bear witness to the grief and suffering of other people, as if we could keep grief at arm's length. What we failed to account for was how the legacies of World War II affected us as well. In our small circles of reconciliation, one man spoke of how his grandfather came back from the Pacific and drank himself to death, and how to this day depression plagues the men in his family. Another young man disclosed that his grandfather had worked on the Manhattan Project, helping develop the bomb, and how 3 generations of his family have wrestled with their sense of guilt and responsibility for what happened. I'm told that my own grandfather came back from the Pacific a changed man. He too became an alcoholic, and he died at 49 of a heart attack. A critical part of reconciliation is tapping into how we are all affected by legacies of violence and injustice, and how our shared suffering can be a path to shared understanding and compassion. I'm just going to close with one final story. The last time the Japanese came to visit us in Washington, they made one request and one only. They wanted us to go together to see the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomber that carried and dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And so we did. One day, a large busload of Japanese and Americans arrived at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum Annex out by Dulles Airport. The arrival of a large group of Japanese visitors immediately set off alarm bells among the Smithsonian security staff. And when we arrived at the Enola Gay, we were met there by the chief of security, who informed us politely but firmly that political and religious demonstrations were strictly forbidden. Well, The Enola Gay hangs suspended from the ceiling of a vast airport hangar among other fighter planes and vintage commercial planes like the Concorde. The space shuttle Discovery is a little on the other side of the room. The museum provides very little information about the devastation wrought by the aircraft. Displayed as it is, the Enola Gay is celebrated as an achievement of American aeronautical ingenuity rather than understood as a delivery system for weapons of mass destruction. I was struck by the sheer size of the plane. The Enola Gay is one of the larger planes on display in the museum, and standing underneath it, looking up at it, a human being can feel awfully small, powerless in the face of its catastrophic force. But beneath it we stood, about 50 of us, half Japanese, half American. We assembled ourselves in a kind of circle so that we could see one another's faces. And I noticed that as we formed that circle, as we looked into one another's eyes, I immediately felt less small, less powerless. And despite the prohibition on religious demonstrations, we went ahead and did one anyways. We stood in a circle and we shared stories and we prayed. We even sang. We held a moment of silence. We wept. And then we left. But I still feel like I'm standing in the shadow of the Enola Gay. That we stand in its shadow. In the shadow of so many wars and injustices and devastations. In the face of which it is so easy for us to feel powerless or afraid. And whenever I feel that way, I remember what it felt like to stand beneath the Enola Gay, how it felt like when we circled around, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, looking in one another's eyes, caring for one another, working together for peace. In that circle of human solidarity, I still felt vulnerable, yes, but I also felt strong and hopeful. And in good company. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I must cast my lot. I will cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, and with no extraordinary power, but nonetheless with power, reconstitute the world. Amen.